You need no introduction. Or should I introduce you?
Yeah,
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So this is our esteemed book author and artist, Nell Painter. She's a fantastic friend of TSL. She's not only visited us several times and has had her work in the gallery, and we're so honored to have you here now. And we have Sarah Broom from Neighbors Woodstock to create the conversation. Sarah's also an esteemed and accomplished writer, so we have some looking forward to this great conversation today. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
And we look forward to your conversation. There's more people coming. We don't want to hold everybody. Here they come.
yeah, I'll get it.
Okay.
Sarah.
Do we start? Or are we waiting? Okay, so I think first I want to just say to you that reading this book was soulful for me. And I think soulful is not a word that I use lightly or even use very often. Because I think I experienced it, this amalgamation of all of your thinking over time as the way that I define art, as something that's deeply layered, existing on multiple registers, and forcing different registers and measures of thought. So I guess now that I've told you my definition of art, I guess I want to start by asking you, how do you actually define art?
How do I define art? My art?
Your art and art.
My art. That's really hard because the way I write, I start books with a question. So it's not like there's a platonic book out there and I bring it down, or I make a drawing on the wall and then I fill it in. It's like one step at a time. And so you have history of white people there. So history of white people started with a question: why are white Americans called Chechens, Caucasians? And then it just kind of went from there. So there's no overarching point. And the art goes the same way. It starts with something, and then I do something else, and something else, and something else, and something else. So the relationship between the hand and the computer and the art and the head and the thought and the gut, they're all mixed up together.
Sure.
And I think probably the best example of how they work together is in one of the Sojourner Truth drawings, in which her face is in the front, but the backdrop is the language on the back of her photographs, which gives her copyright.
Right.
So as we were talking earlier, I am stressing Sojourner Truth as an author.
And so when you are when you're making visual art that is about Sojourner Truth, because you talk so much in this book, what I'm intrigued by are the ways that you are a writer, a historian, an essayist, a creative nonfiction writer, and you're also a visual artist. And so when you're making visual art of Sojourner Truth, what happens in that visual art that gives you access to something that you maybe don't have in the writing?
Just the doing. So looking hard at the photographs and knowing that the words around the photographs have their own story. I was looking at the photograph. I was looking at the back of the photograph, and focusing on the back of the photograph gave me a new way into Sojourner Truth author.
I love that because I think for me as a writer, I can feel very much the stricture of words. I can feel that words are very limited in a way. And I think I experience visual artists as having a different kind of space to play with.
Yes.
So I think that's where my question comes from.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it.
You know, I learned something about you. You start the book with the section autobiography, and I'm obsessed with origins and the idea of our origin story. And I wondered if you could, because one thing I learned, we're both Cal babies, right? We both went to UC Berkeley.
That's right.
I didn't know that you had a degree in anthropology. And I really want to hear you talk a little bit about how you came to anthropology and how you think, looking at the span of things, since you are a historian, too, how you sort of integrated anthropology into this long life of work.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
Is that an okay question to ask you?
It's really big.
It is.
Nobody's
big.
asked me that
That's
before.
all right.
So I think on my feet here, or on my butt. I graduated from the University of California, Berkeley in 1964, in the spring before free speech. I'm before everything. And I'm also before affirmative action. So we were very few Black students. Everybody knew, you could tell they just knew that we were dumb and that we're not going to get good grades and we're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to succeed. That was just in the air. It was the air of the 50s, basically, that said the only people who count here are white men. And we don't even have to say that. Everybody just knows that. It's just an assumption. It's in the water, it's in the air. And so it meant that all my classes, except for in anthropology, were all about white people. I'm from the Bay Area. I was tracked as gifted practically from the time I got out of my mother's womb, which meant I was always in school with white people. And so I just got tired of white people. And the only place I could find some non-white people was in anthropology.
That's interesting.
But also, there was a woman named May Diaz who was, I don't know if she was a communist, if her husband was a communist, they were remembered as good Marxists. She was such a mentor to me. So in this whited out world of, we could just look at you and know that even if you're an honor student, which I was, you're a dumbbell. May Diaz was not like that. And so that was another reason. I also had, I was studying cultural anthropology, and Franz Boas, that was the Boasian field. And one of the things that Franz Boas did that was so helpful was to separate biology from culture. That sounds so basic, but I think most people don't. And I realized that most people don't. Again, you know, the advertisements for how you get your DNA and everything. And so in the advertisements, there's the Irish American woman who discovers that she can fish, and she loves fishing. And
she's like, I'm Native American.
Well, Irish, but yeah, somebody else says I'm Native American, and then they put feathers in their hair.
Yeah.
The African American woman puts a gaily on.
Right.
She says, I'm Nigerian or something. And they are totally confusing their biology and culture.
Sure.
So we need to call Francois back and remind us that what runs in your veins and what makes your hip hurt is not the same thing as your culture.
Right. And I think one of the things you talk about is that during your time at Berkeley, you saw Malcolm X twice in your life.
That was in Ghana.
Right.
Yeah.
But I thought you
That's
also
right,
write
that's right.
that you saw him.
He was once in Berkeley, right.
Right,
So
and you were part of a handful of Black students, so this goes to what you're saying.
Yeah.
And your quote is that you were sidelined players in his American drama.
Oh, really?
That's what you wrote.
Yes. Yeah.
And the reason I love that I get to repeat your words back to you is that it's such an honorable big thing that you have this immense body of work. It's so big, you can't even remember the lines you know? So, but I wanted to talk a little bit, and the reason I brought up anthropology is because for me, in reading you, it feels like there's a lot of ethnography in how you talk about your experiences and work. When you wrote Old in Art School, the way that you are at the bus stop among the kids,
Yeah.
right? When the kid says, "How old are you?" Right?
Yeah.
And the way you report on that, you're not that annoyed that she cares so much about your age.
Yeah.
You're simply gaining insight.
Yeah, taking notes.
That's a very
Yeah.
specific way of seeing
But I'll
things.
tell you what happened. This is like the first day that I was at Rutgers. And so it would have been very early and everybody would have been new. So, and they're all, Rutgers is all spread, this is Rutgers, New Brunswick, all spread out. You have to take a bus from this to that to that. And I'm still waiting for the bus. And this young woman recognized me from the day before when we had been in orientation at Mason Gross. And she said, "How old are you?" And I said, 64. She said, "I gotta tell my mom about this." Told her mom about it.
And she did it right in front of your
Right
face.
in front of me, yeah. I had to tell my mom about
That's the kicker. You know, part of the enjoyment, I think, of a collection of your essays over time is that, you know, unlike the dominant narratives in our culture where we focus on the high notes, I think what I found really enjoyable here is the way that we got to sort of veer off course with you a little
you
bit.
like the pissed off parts?
I really love the pissed off parts. And I kept saying, how did she learn to do this? It's so great that you're like, I'm just mad. And here's why, and here's
And it happened
I'm
a
mad.
quarter of a century ago.
You know, I know. It's
Still
kind of
big.
great. I thought this woman, she's free. This woman is free, okay? But I also wanted to talk about the way that I find that you're really interested in people who kind of toe the line of being mysterious and visible. There are people who come up, like Mary Quinn Sullivan, who you take time with, and you help us understand, even Alma Thomas in a way. You take her out of the frame of Lois Mallow and the people we're used to hearing about. And these are people who are kind of, or even Delaney, Martin Delaney, right? It's people kind of who aren't talked about, who could disappear quite possibly. And you take time with them. So specifically Mary Quinn Sullivan. Could you talk a little bit about what drew you to her, and tell us a little bit about her, because I found her to be so interesting.
Okay. Mary Quinn Sullivan was one of the 3 women founders of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The other 2 were wealthy Brahmins, women. One was Abby Rockefeller, and one was, what's her name? The other one. Send the little truck back in there. Lily Bliss. Yeah. So very wealthy women, Republicans, WASP. And here's Mary Quinn Sullivan, who's Irish American, and this is taking place early in the 20th century, so there's still a lot of anti-Irish prejudice. And whereas Rockefeller and Bliss were Easterners, Bliss was, I think, from New York or Massachusetts, and Rockefeller's family was from Rhode Island and New York. And Mary Quinn Sullivan was from Indiana, and she'd gone to public school. So she didn't quite fit. I did not pick her out. I was asked to write on her, and I wrote on her against a deadline in 2020. The book still has not come out. From MoMA on its women founders. So I learned a lot about the early history of MoMA, and I think what I brought to this was not so much art history, but American history and understanding how this woman who was, her grandfather was the immigrant, but she had grown up out in the country outside of Indianapolis. But she brought an energy that I call immigrant energy, and she knew what she was doing. She was the best educated of these three women.
Right.
And
the image of her was a standout image.
Yeah.
It separated her
It did.
from the other women. So the images of all three women, they were certain types of, and we're talking about when photography was hugely important in how we saw women and women presented.
Like 1930, 1932, around in there. Yeah.
And can you describe the image of her?
Yeah, well, first of all, Rockefeller is in her Rockefeller house, la-di-da. And Lily Bliss is wearing some clothes that you can't afford. But Mary Quinn Sullivan is sitting in a chair, sort of relaxed a bit, and behind her is something that looks like chicken wire. So it's an art photograph in a way that the other two are not. So she is telling you that she knows what she's doing.
That's right. And in the book you write, which I laughed at, it looks like chicken wire hanging in front of a sheet.
Art.
Art, yes. So I feel that it would be crazy to be on this turf in the Hudson Valley Catskills area and not talk about Sojourner Truth.
Well,
at least briefly, right?
Sure.
And I always feel that people think they have a clear sense of her. But I wonder about if you could talk a little bit about, because you've written an entire book about Sojourner Truth, A Life Assemble. And is it fair to say you're obsessed with clarifying this one?
Just because I talk about it all the time?
Yes. I guess I want to think a little bit with you, because you talk a lot about the idea of art's power over history. That's something it seems like you care about.
It is.
And I feel that when you talk about Sojourner Truth, it puts you right in the nexus where the self of you that's the historian and the self of you that's the artist kind of dukes it out in a way, or tries to accommodate all the feelings about art and history. So could we talk a little bit about what Frances Dana Gage did and why you think it brought you to that place?
Yeah. Frances Dana Gage was a writer. She was a journalist, and so for me, she is an artist. She crafted the most famous word depiction of Sojourner Truth, which is very dramatic. It has Sojourner Truth braving these pusillanimous white women who were being beaten down by white men who didn't want her to come to their meeting in the first place because they didn't want to. I'm channeling Frances Dana Gage right now. So Frances Dana Gage's story is of this strange figure who comes to a meeting where she's not necessarily welcome, but she speaks up in a very dramatic way to say that all women deserve their rights, working women deserve their rights, Black women deserve their rights. And then Gage inserts a refrain across what is quoting Sojourner Truth is saying. And Gage has Sojourner Truth saying, "Aren't I a woman?" 4 times. And in this scenario, Sojourner Truth sort of picks up the white women and delivers them, and she electrifies the meeting. Now, it's true that Sojourner Truth did say words to the effect that all women deserve their citizenship rights, that working women deserve their citizenship rights, that Black women deserve their citizenship rights, and that she has done a lot of work and she deserves her rights. She did say that. The reason I know is that there was somebody who was a designated amanuensis at the meeting, an abolitionist named Marius Robinson, who was Sojourner Truth's host in northern Ohio, who knew her, but he wrote down what she said in standard English, which damned that version of Sojourner Truth, because the big public wanted a real Black person to speak in dialect and to be very dramatic. So Sojourner Truth went to this meeting for women's rights in Akron in 1851. And then she continued going around talking and selling her books for years. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, the best-selling author in maybe not the world, but certainly in the United States, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote an essay in the Atlantic on Sojourner Truth. Very dramatic, very stereotyped, and it has Sojourner Truth silence a meeting by saying, "Frederick, is God dead?" So another rhetorical question that electrifies the meeting.
Right.
So this is 1863. Sojourner Truth had spoken up in 1851. Gage was working with the Free People in South Carolina, and she read what Harriet Beecher Stowe had written. Harriet Beecher Stowe had written that Sojourner Truth was dead, which she was not. And Gage said to herself, "I've got a better Sojourner Truth than that." And she wrote her version.
Right.
And her version went into the basic source material for second wave feminists in the 20th century, which was a collection of the documents for the women's suffrage. So Sojourner Truth is the only Black woman in that collection, and Gage's version of Sojourner Truth is in that collection. So in the 20th century, somebody, I don't know who, said, aren't I a woman? That doesn't sound like Sojourner Truth. She must have said, ain't I a woman? And so you will hear, ain't I a woman? And the reason I'm on such a campaign about this is that the slogan, ain't I a woman, has displaced the person. And if you know only ain't I a woman and Sojourner Truth was enslaved, then the assumption is Sojourner Truth was a Southerner. And all the rest of the history, if you care, you just pile on there. Sojourner Truth was from exits 18 and 19, 87.
Yes, I get off at 19.
Yeah.
So we're from the same place.
You're right there, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a cold, rocky, hilly place. It is not the plantation south.
Right. But you describe the fact, you call it the national hunger for simplifying history.
Yes.
And I think maybe that's how, not maybe why, but perhaps that's how this could continue in this way.
Well, that's
And
generous of you.
Right.
toward the American
But you also
people.
describe it as, I'm going to read a quote of yours. Because I think this is really important. So this was in your essay after the riot, which came after the terrible events in January 6th. So you're actually reflecting on your book Exodusters, which appeared in 1977. So what I love is that it's you of 2021 reflecting on the you of 1977. And in this essay you write, my dissertation and book were considered Black, not American history. You describe the book as being exiled from both American history and Southern history.
Yeah.
And so part of your campaign, as you just put it, I feel that those things are in the same line, in a way. That you have been saying this.
Oh, yeah.
You have been talking about Sojourner Truth in this way.
Yes, for 25 years.
For 25 years. So you said I was putting it too nicely when I talked about this. So how would you put it?
I would talk about, did you say lazy?
I said the hunger for simplifying.
Yeah, that's a nicer way.
Yeah.
I would say Americans are lazy about history, and especially lazy about Black history, especially lazy about women's history, and especially lazy about Black women's history. So, I had so many struggles with people who think that I am denigrating Sojourner Truth by taking away Ain't I a Woman. I say, I'm going to take away Ain't I a Woman, and I'm going to give you a New Yorker who used her citizenship rights in New York to recover her son, to defend herself in court in the 1830s, to buy houses, to self-publish a book, to go around by herself and distribute her book, to say the things that she said she knew needed to be said, and who had Black women peers.
Right.
If we just had Ain't I a Woman, we don't know that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was even tougher on white women.
Sure.
Than
Because that's part of what you bring up. And this goes back to you talking about invisibility, especially of the Black woman, right? You talk about all these other women who were doing similar work at the same time of Sojourner Truth, whose names we never hear of.
That's right.
And it would we would think of her differently if we saw her in the context, Sojourner Truth, if we saw her in the context of other Black women, or even in the context of
I made that point a quarter of a century ago, and it didn't stick.
Right.
But I'm writing about Sojourner Truth again because Sojourner Truth has changed. She has changed in that she is very well known now. And I think Americans are ready now to hear what I'm saying in a way they were not a quarter of a century ago.
Okay, so we're all going to look for that one, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to talk about, actually, I want to ask you about when you were putting this collection together, because I happen to know that you were at McDowell and you were at Yaddo, and there are these fabulous images on very waxy paper. I hope you have your copy. It was a complicated process. And so I really want to know something about your experience of revisiting these selves, the selves of you who wrote. I mean, there are pieces that,
There are a couple of pieces from the 80s.
The 80s.
Yeah.
So what was it like to revisit that process of revisiting those former selves and all their different iterations of thought? And then how was it to integrate the visual parts?
Yes. Well, to organize it, I had a lot of help on Facebook.
Facebook? How so?
So I would say to my Facebook people, I'm trying to organize this thing. I don't know what to do with history and Southern history. That was my first field, Southern history. And I know that Southern history is not exactly the same as American history or history, period.
Were you wondering about whether to separate them in the book?
Right.
Because now you have a chapter, if you haven't read it yet. There's history and then there's Southern history.
Right.
So what happened? How did you start this sort of line of inquiry?
So I said to my people on Facebook, how am I going to organize this? Southern history is history, but then again, it's not the same.
Say more.
It's not this. The questions are not the same. The answers are not the same. The historiography is not the same. The assumptions that we've cast aside are not the same. And so I asked my Facebook friends, and they said, well, you should have two sections, one called history and one called Southern history. And so if you learned how to outline in school, this is not a good outline. This is not a good outline. But it makes sense.
I like that. I wasn't expecting that.
It makes sense.
So the people on Facebook pushed you toward separating the two.
Yeah.
And how many followers do you have? I'm just curious.
Supposedly, I have the limit of 5,000.
Okay.
Somehow, I only hear from the same people, which is okay.
Okay.
People keep telling me.
It's like 10 people who write you over and over.
More than 10.
Okay.
Yeah. But at the end of the book, I say thank you to social media.
I saw that. What was the process of creating these works to accompany the text, or how did you conceive of the text and the visual?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I was at Yaddo in an art studio, so I had a big wall. And I would make my art and put it on the wall. And there's an image in the book of that wall. Some of the pieces didn't make it into the book. Maybe they'll go into the new Sojourner Truth. But to have a big wall to move things around, and then a big table to think about the images and the text together, that was one of the gifts of Yaddo and an artist residency.
And so were you, because you said your writing work comes from, you form a question and the work evolves from there.
Yeah.
What happens when you're making visual art?
Same thing.
The same thing. You start with the question and the piece
Yeah.
evolves.
The question is a drawing. And so I work by hand, and then I manipulate it digitally. And the great thing about digital manipulation is that it doesn't have meaning like discursive meaning. So I noticed when people would come to my studio, if they were not artists, they would say, "Oh, what does that mean? What is the meaning of the pink in the dress? What are the images there?" But the artist would come and say, "How did you do that?"
Right.
And it's the "how did you do that"
Yeah.
part. It's the process that is so satisfying. And the reason I love working digitally is that sometimes things happen that I don't plan
When you're working digitally.
Yeah, I mean, that can happen.
So when you're going by hand, so help me, because I am a process nerd. I love process.
Good.
It's my favorite portion of everything. So I really want to slow down a little bit and understand how we get to the finished, or maybe not finished, pieces that exist. So first, you make sketches of everything, or something.
Sometimes I work from a photograph, though. So, for instance, in last year in 23, I was in Headlands back in the Bay Area, which is so beautiful. And I knew that I was facing time pressure. So I didn't really spend very much time drawing, but I took a lot of photographs. And so I put a photograph on the wall and then draw just little 6 by 6 inches watercolors. And so that was the art I made using photographs as a mnemonic device.
Right.
But the great thing about pixels and working digitally is that it doesn't have any brains. So this pixel doesn't care what it's next to, if it makes sense. Pixels don't have sense. And they're done when you turn your computer on.
And you find that to be different from the way you work.
Yeah.
Right. When you're because as a writer, there is a kind of world you go into, a portal maybe.
Yes.
And you're very much, I think, in that portal until the thing is made.
Yes.
So when you're revising your visual art, what we call revision.
It's different. It's really
What
different.
is that process like? How do you revise your visual art? Because you're coming from a world that's very evidence-based, that's very formulaic in a way, into a world where you say, the pixels don't care.
Yeah.
How do you...
There are two kinds of meaning. So in text, there's discursive meaning. So does this word go with this word and that word? But in art, it's visual meaning. So it's what your eye prefers.
Except for when you're making pieces that have both words and...
That's why they don't all go in. Sometimes the words work and sometimes they don't. But often they're not legible.
Right.
So you can look at it and just know there's some words in there, but you may not know.
Right, it's not, because there's a series in here.
Yeah.
That marvelous series, I forgot what it's called. I think it's where you ask people say, why are we like this?
Well,
or the question is more specifically.
Early 2017, right after Trump was inaugurated. And
it says, you say this can't really be America series.
Yeah.
Where you reply.
I say, this could be America, sure. Yeah.
You say, yes, this is the America I know.
Yeah.
So in that series.
Yes. Very clear, discursive.
Right.
And that piece is in the Sarah Lawrence Museum and the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I made some prints inspired by William Still, and they're in 2 places, but that is probably my favorite, other people's favorite.
That's a really good series. And when you're using, for instance, your text that you've made, the history of white people, you've used some of that text in pieces that you've made.
I don't remember. That was a long time ago.
Okay. And
so there's a map that I made, and I was working on the history of white people.
Right.
So that's there, but it's a freehand map.
And there's some where you've taken language from the book itself.
Yeah.
And you've
that's
made
right.
visual images over the
that.
language of the book.
Yes.
And the thing I'm interested in asking you about is, the way that a film can be made of a book. Do you have any relationship when you're taking your work and manipulating it?
Yeah.
You've now taken this book that was a giant bestseller and you're now using parts of it in this other media.
Yeah.
Does that feel, what's the feeling of that?
It's great. Yeah. Cut this sucker off.
Yeah. What is the feeling?
My eyes are happy. Yeah.
You don't have a sense of, the killing your babies thing?
No, one of the things I learned at the drawing and painting marathon at the studio school is that you can work really hard on a drawing and then erase it. And I could work really hard on a drawing or a painting and cut it up.
Wow, that would be hard for me to do, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm also not a practicing visual artist.
No, I couldn't have done it without going to the drawing and painting. I mean, when they said, these were great big sheets of paper, and so there was a model, and you're doing this big figurative drawing, and it's in a studio, it's hot, and you're slow, and you're working really, really hard, and you get it right, and then the teacher comes in and says, rub it out, and then draw it again 10 inches to the right. And then you do that, and they come back and they say, rub it out and make it 10% smaller. And then you do that and you think, yeah, I could do that.
So the thing that I think that's horrifying to imagine, but I'm glad you're describing it for all of us, and I want to move on quickly. I want to ask you a little bit about vocabulary and words, because we can all see that this is a very verbal person.
I just keep talking.
And you've built a vocabulary over time in your work as a historian, as an essayist, as a thinker. You're an eminent historian. So what happens in the art for you? Is there a kind of language, a vocabulary that you're making? What are the things you're working with that are part of your system of organization?
It's very tactile. It's the mediums. So, for instance, I was not a watercolorist, and I'm still not a watercolorist, but when I went to Headlands, a dear friend took me to a shop in the Sunset District of San Francisco. It's called A Case for Making, and they make their own watercolors. Fantastic watercolors. So, of course, I had to buy some. And then they have a little block, 6 inches by 6 inches of watercolor paper, and that's what I was working with. So this was much smaller than I had worked on before, with a new medium. So it was just playing. It was very enjoyable.
I marvel at that, because I feel that you're maybe taking for granted or underplaying the enormous nature of being able to move from one realm into another.
Well, it takes 2 weeks
to sort of shift, right?
Exactly.
I mean, because it feels like you're moving. I mean, there's this quotation in the book that I love where you say, I throw verbal coherence to the wind.
Yeah.
Heedless of the original appearance of my photographic archive, I copy, fracture, combine, and distort its images, disregarding the photographer's original intent according to my own eye's impulse.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, and you talk about like the meaninglessness that you saw in becoming an artist, right? To just not think so much. Can you talk a little bit about that state that you go to? Because it's an aspirational thing for me to be in this non-thinking.
Yeah. Well, let me step back a little bit to when I was teaching graduate students at Princeton, and they would start their dissertations, and they'd be so worried. And I would say, just write it down. Don't worry, just write it down. You're going to throw away the first 100 pages anyway. But that's how I feel about writing. I just start by writing, and one of the things that visual art did for me is that I now very often start writing a draft with an ink pen on paper. And
so that it has permanence?
no, there's something sort of freeing. This gets to nuances that I couldn't have thought of somehow. Writing on the
Using the hand.
Yeah, using the hand gets to different kinds of meanings. And that is a very helpful way even to write. Yeah.
Sure.
But it started, the understanding the difference between verbal meaning and visual meaning, that came thanks to one of my teachers at the Rhode Island School of Design, Judy, long last name. And because at Mason Gross and at the Rhode Island School of Design, my teachers didn't want me to draw on my historical background. They didn't want me to use text. And that was really hard. And finally, I got so I could make images with my eyes. But it was actually the Black Eyed Peas who taught me to do this. I was the last person in the world to come to the Black Eyed Peas. But
and this is not the food for those who don't know.
Oh, right. So the Black Eyed Peas, and probably anybody who makes music now, the part they do in the studio is just a tiny part, and then they manipulate it endlessly afterwards. And it doesn't try to sound like it was just made in this, in a concert hall. It's self-consciously and proudly digital, artificial.
Right.
So that was really a big leap for me to get to the point where digital meaninglessness was just fine.
Is it a blank space, or is there a there?
Well, when you say there, I think of Tony Orange's novel set in my hometown of Oakland. But I don't make preparatory. I was going to say I don't make preparatory drawings, but I'm not sure that's true, especially with watercolor, because it's not.
It's hard to control.
Yeah, you can't go back over.
Sure.
But since I am not known for a particular kind of art. I can make whatever art I want.
I think that's a pretty profound line on which to end. I have so much admiration for what you've made, and you inspire me. And I'm thankful for this conversation.
Well,
You've taught me a lot tonight, so thank you. Questions from the audience? Does anyone in the audience want to ask anything of Miss Nell or Painter? The great?
Kim, you have a question?
Okay. Well, I had so many questions, but one thing that stood out from which, by the way, the conversation was amazing. Both of you, thank you. One thing that stood out was your ability to describe visuals so well. So I mean, it's not surprising to me that you are also a visual artist. For instance, the description that you gave of the three women who founded MoMA was, I could see it. I could actually see it. So, and then I was thinking about the practice of ekphrasis and describing. And so is there any of that going on in your work? Like, do you collaborate with yourself in a way, where you have an image and then write about it, or vice versa?
Some time ago, I did. A piece that is not in this book is on the relationship between the word and the image, ekphrasis. But it didn't work for this collection. But I have thought a lot about words and images, mostly before I went to art school. So I decided to go to art school after Sojourner Truth taught me the pleasure of dealing with images. I had gotten into talking about her photographs back when I did the first biography, because text didn't do what I needed. It was a weakness in text. But then I realized that I was just enjoying dealing with images. And that's why I took the next step. So, there are two different ways of working, but as you'll see in here, they can be brought together. But I make a lot of work when I'm making art. I also write a lot of words when I'm writing. And so by just making and then remaking and then remaking, and then it's kind of a branching way of working, and then going back to curate to figure out what works. That's what the wall did. Right. So it's not the same, and they may not even be related in terms of the process. Yeah. In the back.
Could you touched on it, but could you elaborate on your chapter, which I haven't read yet, but I plan to? After the riot, partisanship, and political life in the wake of January 6th, could you elaborate a little more on that and maybe bring it up to any thoughts today?
Yeah, I hope I'm going to be talking about the essay that you're interested in. That's not the capitalized white essay, is it? No.
I just read the title.
Yeah, what's the title?
After the riot, partisanship and political life in the wake of January 6th.
Oh, yeah. That's about the colorizing of our
Voting system.
voting, yeah. So what I'm saying here is that because we're so dependent on media for understanding what's going on in the world or what's going on in the country, visual media, that this process has colorized voting. Since 2020, the people who were concerned most about voting rights have been Black people. And even though in the voting in 2020, we had a lot of images of voters, I think the most poignant ones were of Black voters having to stand in line and standing in line, old people standing in line for a long time. So that process, the mediatization of voting and the importance that Black citizens place on voting have colorized voting, and voting is the quintessential action of citizenship, have colorized voting and citizenship Black. The riot colorized rioting as white. Now, have you been confused about why, after all the wonderful things that Joe Biden has done as president, he still is falling behind the ogre? You ever?
I could say a lot of bad things about Trump supporters.
No. We won't do that. But anyway, I think, and people say, we don't understand how this is happening. How can this be? I think it is because millions of Americans just say, oh, well, Biden is the Black people's president. Because of the colorization of the actions, that democracy is now a Black thing. We'll see how many non-Black Americans can fit themselves comfortably in the Black Party. We know that millions of white Americans can slot themselves very comfortably in the white party.
But that is part of what the point is that you're making, that this is a terrible direction to go in, that our democracy is going to be irretrievable if we're now colorizing, racializing voting, you know.
I think it would be okay. The scary thing is if millions of non-Black Americans say, I can't go there. And I'm not totally worried about that because they kind of had that choice in 2020.
Right, I understand. But it feels to me that if voting is colorized as a Black thing, then our democracy suffers.
Well, we know our democracy is suffering.
One would have to
We know that.
buy into a very racist version of how the world works in order to participate in the...
No, I wouldn't say that. I think it would, well, I'm not a white person, so I can't speak. I mean, I can't speak for Black people either, so I'll just keep talking. I think that it will be possible for masses of non-Black Americans to say, this democracy is more important than my feeling judged by the company I'm keeping as a voter.
Sure.
Yeah.
So maybe women could be put in that same category.
Well, certainly there's a lot of misogyny in voting activity. And not enough people could do it in 2016. I worry for Kamala Harris because she's a woman. But yeah, maybe enough non-women or even women, because it turns out that if not a majority, a whole lot of white women voted for Trump both times.
Right,
You know?
that's right.
I was wondering, just in this conversation, how you think of like Kanye West visiting Trump in the White House and sort of promoting his support for him, or more recently Tim Scott out of South Carolina kind of campaigning and hoping to become maybe the vice presidential nominee with Trump, and the way that shows up in the media.
You know something?
That's fine.
I don't go there. This is one thing I worry about with my liberal and progressive friends who tear up their stomach lining over things they cannot do anything about. So I am concentrating on what goes on in New Jersey, what goes on in Essex County. I live in 2 Essex counties. I live in Essex County in New Jersey and Essex County in New York. I don't vote here, so I can't vote against Elise Stefanik, who would be my representative. So I show up where I can show up, and I don't spend any time worrying about the rest.
I love that. Anything else?
But you talk about the big picture a lot, too.
That's not worrying about it.
True, good point.
I mean, how many of my good left friends are tearing their hair out about what's going on with Trump? We have no way of reaching Trump, and unless you have a more heterogeneous group of friends than I do, you have no way of reaching. I mean, even if I could reach them, I wouldn't want to. Reaching Trump supporters or MAGA people. So, just let that go.
That's good advice. Can I just mention one more thing that I think we do have some control over, and since this is a book reading, the issue of censorship.
Yeah.
And, I think it was in February, there was a new list of writers who have been excluded from many of the AP
Yes.
board tests. One of them is June Jordan, who was the reason I went to Berkeley.
Yeah.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Oh, yeah.
Kianga Yamada Taylor, who writes for the New Yorker. I think that's terrifying.
Yeah.
And I wonder, because that feels like something that we actually have the power to affect on a very
I'm sure
small
that
local
you're
level.
a member of the Authors Guild. That's one way to do something, support the Authors Guild. But I remember at the end of February, I was talking at Yale, and a member of the audience asked a question about the banning of books. And he said, tearing his hair, how are we going to deal with this terrible banning of books? And then he started talking about Florida. And I said, you're going to have to move to Florida and run for the school board.
Yes. Literally. Yeah. Right. I mean, I think all of us, if we have a local, we all have school boards and we all have libraries, and there is something we could actually all do about it.
Is that a question?
That's it?
No?
Well, I want to say thank you very much to both of you, and I also want to tell everyone, of course, the books are for sale over here, and Linda can be your bookmeister. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great conversation.
Yeah.
Oh,